homie went out to get revenge. Don't want to hear nothing you talking about.
I just woke up and I'm pretty exhausted, but I saw this video last night before going to bed, and I wanted to really address a couple of parts of this conversation that not many people are kind of connecting the dots in. And again, in an era of globalization where we are becoming more and more aware of each other globally, I think we need to make the connections between these dots. Now, if you can justify what Rodney did, then you have no business not understanding the plight of the Philistine people. Okay? You have no business not understanding any form of resistant group that your government has labeled a terrorist group. And I'm talking like globally, not just in Philistine. Now, I can understand the danger as well that this creator is talking about, where you create a cycle where the person who is the victim of the retaliation then also becomes the perpetrator of the resistance, so to speak, or the action of responding. But in this particular case, there is a power dynamic issue. There is a power dynamic issue that we need to take account. And if we're going to think about this intellectually in a way that we need to find a solution, we still have to address the core problem, which is the major power imbalance between two groups, which enables one to oppress the other in the first place. And this week we had Red Dress Day, which is basically commemorative of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and being on this stolen land, this unceded territory belonging to the multiple Indigenous groups of Turtle Island. I feel responsible to talk about this, especially since I'm in so-called Canada. And if we're going to talk about it honestly, 100% of the cases involving Indigenous people going missing involve the cops. They may not involve the cops directly, although many of them I'm sure do. But they also involve their intentional negligence, their criminal negligence, Robert Picton levels of criminal negligence, where they just look the other way, while multiple Indigenous human beings, this week we're specifically talking about the femmes, the women, the girls, the two-spirit, but many men as well, are literally being intentionally kidnapped and terminated by the RCMP and by police. And if we're going to be really radically honest, this is the biggest genocide that's occurring that we are continuously, intentionally ignoring on a regular basis. And when we look at this particular genocide, this is by a peoples whose, despite their treaties not being honored, despite their land being stolen, despite their money being held in trust without their consent, as if they are incapable of logical thinking, they haven't retaliated with violence. And there has been no progress towards liberation. And so as we look at this particular case in the United States, if we want to criticize any form of violent resistance, then we also have to criticize the same violent forms of resistance that somehow humanized you and me on all of this stolen land after we've been stolen one way or another, either through the transatlantic slave, oh my gosh, I can't speak because it's the morning, the transatlantic slave trade, or coerced immigration, which robs essentially most people who come here of their finances and abilities to leave, while simultaneously also robbing them of their dignity. Yes, this may begin a cycle of escalation, but I'm going to be abundantly honest in saying that escalation is what brought attention to Philistine in the first place. Because the fact is, most of you still wouldn't know what is happening in Palestine, which has been happening for the better part of a century. Had October 7th not happened, sometimes the only response to violence is violence. And the reason why there is no progress in the Western world is because your own citizens are complicit and peaceful. Peaceful. Which we now know simply means tolerating the abuse. Because the only peace anybody is receiving is the peace that the abuser is getting from your suffering and silence. And I say this as people who retaliated. I watched my people retaliate in Tahrir Square. I saw family and friends risk their lives. I witnessed my people get demolished by American interference after they finally started to resist. And they still didn't get any closer to the level of freedom that racialized people have in North America. Not that we have much. All this to say, the very little freedoms we got here were unfortunately through violent resistance. And the fact is, it seems to be the only way to deal with colonizers who just won't humanize us. And it's not an issue of can't, it's an issue of won't. So two things can be true at the same time. Rodney can be justified. And it can also be an unfortunate, not best thing to do. Sorry, phone call, life happens, but all this to say, you can't reason with those who don't want to be reasoned with. That's a discomfort that we're all going to have to sit in. Even those of you who don't want to admit that you see what's going on and are choosing to ignore it.